So Fareed, that was a fantastic presentation. I was mingling with the audience during dinner, and everybody was very complimentary and said that you stimulated a lot of great discussion at their tables. Particularly, you know, your comments about there's the economics of it all, but the global politics, which is perhaps slower to catch up. So the first question that I have, and I just want you to know, when I read these books, I fill out, a couple questions. I filled out 18 pages of questions that I wanted to ask you while I read your book, but that goes last. The first question I have is from the audience. So the global economic revolution is shedding light on cultural practices, particularly in China and India, that discriminate and devalue women. Do you see this changing with the new world order that you describe? If so, why and for how long?
That's a great question, because one of the things I notice that is happening in places like India, Egypt, is the power of capitalism to upend traditional structures of society. Now, let me be clear. Capitalism is, in my opinion, the best economic system. Or put it another way, it's the worst economic system except for all the others.
Right.
But it's not perfect. It has many problems. It has inequities. But this is one thing that it does that is really quite remarkable, which is you go to a country like India that has had 5,000 years of caste hierarchy. And it has been virtually impossible to change this in any meaningful sense. And then politics tries, and you create quotas and affirmative action, and that does something, but it causes resentment and it causes a backlash. And then you have genuine free market economics and capitalism at work, and people start getting rich from all across the socioeconomic spectrum and the caste spectrum. And that has done more than anything else to change the way in which India has been ordered. So all of a sudden the richest guy in the village is this lower caste entrepreneur. And now all of a sudden it's not such a bad thing to be lower caste, because guess what? He's got the big car, right? And that reality it changes people's cultural mindsets. The question you ask is a very interesting one, because despite that reality, it has not had as much effect on the situation of women. And I think that this may be because while your caste, your ethnic group, these are political categorizations in a sense, and they are enforced at the level of politics and at the level of society. Women, the discrimination is enforced both at that level, but also at the level of the family. So much of the discrimination that women face, unfortunately, in the world is at the hands of other women. So when you look at Africa, where you have this absolutely horrendous practice of female castration, it is mostly done by women, by grandmothers enforcing a diktat, the mothers that enforce, it was done to them, so it must be the right thing. Similarly, you see that in societies where women are placed in a very confining role, that social and familial structure in which that exists is often enforced by the women in the family. And so it's taken a lot to break it. And this may be a case where it isn't just enough to have capitalism and markets and people getting rich, though that again helps. If you look at South Korea, if you look at Singapore, these places where very traditional societies modernize, the role of women has been transformed. But short of that, what I'm struck by is when you go to China today, women really are equals in China. They are equal in terms of their participation. It's very interesting to go to China and Japan in that respect. Japan, much richer, much more advanced, modernized society. You go to a classic business meeting in Japan, and the women are all, taking your tea orders and standing quietly in the background and not being obtrusive. In China, very often, they'll actually be part of the decision-making circle. They'll be sitting there equals, and their attitude is non-deferential. Why is that? Because one of the great things Mao Zedong did, and Mao Zedong did not do a lot of great things, is he broke that hierarchy, that family hierarchy. He ended the practice of foot binding. He integrated women. And that reality has given China enormous spirit. I mean, Chinese women are really the richest real estate developer in China today. Is a woman. There's a real estate company called Soho Real Estate in Beijing. And more than occasional examples, it really is widespread. And so maybe for something like this fight for women's equality, which is so important, it's 50% of the population, for goodness sakes, it's not going to happen magically by market forces. It's going to be something that people are going to have to actually do something about. And when you look at particularly places like Africa, where you still have these absolutely ghastly practices like female castration, that isn't, the market isn't going to solve that. That's where politics and civic action comes in.
Thank you. I know we've got a question there, and I'll just ask the audience, we're going to try to get as many questions in, so if you can try to keep your questions shorter than his answers, that would be terrific. Sure.
Ready for you. Yeah.
I saw President Obama with the Prime Minister of Japan the other day, reinforcing America's commitment to its long-standing alliance with Japan. And all of which was in the larger context of what you just spoke about in the dispute over the islands. Is America's Cold War policy of supporting Japan appropriate now in this new Asia with this dynamic China?
It's a wonderful question, because you're absolutely right to remind us that the American position on Japan is a relic of the Cold War. The American alliance, the security alliance with Japan, is a relic of the Cold War. But here's what is happening in Asia, and why the policy does have some relevance but has to, of course, be reshaped. People always say Asia is rising. As somebody who grew up in Asia, I know that that doesn't make any sense, because Asia is actually a geographic construct of the West. There is no such thing as Asia. There's Japan, there's China, there's India, and they don't much like each other. I mean, the reality of Asian countries is there is no great long-standing Asian identity. So when you talk about Asia, you're really talking about a geographical space and a perhaps socioeconomic space in which these countries are rising. But they're rising into an atmosphere of a great deal of historical distrust and mutual animosity. And so when you look at what's happened in Asia over the last 2 years, at some point the rise of China began to worry countries in Asia. And those countries, Vietnam, the Philippines, to a certain extent, India, Singapore even, which is, in some ways a Chinese city-state, they came to the United States and said, look, we want there to be some balancing power in Asia that assures us that Asia is not going to be dominated by the Chinese. And so the United States played this role of coming in Obama's pivot to Asia and assuring these Asian countries that they would not be left to the mercy of a kind of Chinese hegemony. So far, so good. It produces some deterrence, which is useful. And frankly, even my Chinese friends who are more enlightened understand that this is a useful thing because it preserves peace and stability in Asia. The danger, and this is where we get to the adjustments of policy, I think, the danger is you don't want to be placed in a position as the United States where your policy toward Asia and your policy toward China is being dictated by Vietnam and the Philippines. You want to make a strategic assessment of what is important for stability in Asia and to pursue that and not be tugged along into every border dispute that the Philippines or Vietnam may have with China, which may be centuries old and may be ones where the Chinese are in the right in the first place. In order to preserve stability in Asia, more than anything else, the United States needs a good relationship with China. The other things are also very important, and it's important to provide some deterrent, but fundamentally nothing will matter more than if we have a good cooperative relationship with China. By the way, most countries in Asia want the United States there because they feel we would be the most able to have a good productive relationship with China, more than they, because we would be able to speak to the Chinese as equals. So we shouldn't lose sight of that. And that means trying a little bit harder than we have been frankly doing to build a strategic relationship with China. I often say to my friends in Washington, if you have a dispute between China and Japan, we have leverage with Japan. We know how to walk them off the cliff. What we don't have right now is any leverage with China. We don't know how to walk them off the cliff. We don't have that built-up trust and mutual respect. That's what we need to work on. Because ideally, you would be in a situation where when you have these kind of flare-ups, and these things happen. Think of that EP-3 plane incident, right, when the American spy. These things happen. The question is, can you walk off the cliff at that point? Or does that turn into some kind of a crisis that builds? We know how to do it with the Japanese. We have the relationships and the leverage. We don't have it with China, and it's very important we develop it.
I think we've got a quick question with Steve Hines, and then we've got Nelson at table, and then just here to the front. So we'll just start with Steve.
Dr. Zakaria, you were born in Mumbai, and you're 49. Is that correct?
I'm exactly.
Yeah. I'm really quite curious, having followed your career for a long time and your articles in CNN and Time magazine. How in the world did you get where you are? Is there any background, of your Indian background, that shows up and that gets you to where you were? I'm thinking of going back 100 years or a little more in India, and the British and the East India Company. I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with the history, but does any of that affect your current thinking?
Gosh, it's a very big, complicated question. I'm not the most introspective person in the world. I think that if I were to look back and say, what are the elements from my past in India that had some impact on my career? Certainly one part of it would be just drive. Being born in India, I grew up in very fortunate circumstances. My parents were middle class and were educated. But to come to America and then to come into a situation where you have, when I was in America, I was on a scholarship and didn't have access to any, there was no safety net. I lost my winter coat once, and was very cold for the next month until I could save up enough money from my dorm job to buy another one. So there's some element of just that sheer drive and perseverance, and I think about it when I look at my kids, who are wonderful kids, but they're not going to have that same drive. I'm proud of the fact that I've produced a circumstance where they won't have that drive, for better or worse. I think some part of it is the ability to see the United States in a different way because, I was once not an American. And I think the most difficult thing for Americans is to imagine what the world looks like if you're not American. It's a big parochial culture of a superpower. And it's very difficult for an American to imagine what the world looks like when you're not the 800-pound gorilla, but you're the mouse looking at the 800-pound gorilla. Well, I was once the mouse. And so I think that plays some part in being able to bring a certain perspective that I think is often missing in American politics, and being able to instantly, almost instinctively, look at a problem in comparative perspective. So, when we've had our gun violence issues, the first column I wrote, and what I was surprised by was the only column anybody wrote initially, was the one which said, well, can we just stop and take note of the fact that we have 11,000 gun homicides a year, place like Canada, Britain, France has something between 1/12th and 1/50th that number. You know, Britain will have 50, we will have 11,000 this year. That sense of just, you know, and being able to think about those issues where, you know, when people say, well, it's of course our violent movie culture, to be able to say, well, no, actually the Brits watch the same movies. You know, trust me, I grew up in India. We watch the same movies. We don't go around shooting each other. So some part of it is that. The Indian piece and the anti-colonial piece specifically, I think in some sense, I have a healthy respect for capitalism, free markets, modern life, that I think, you know, and this is particular. I grew up in a quasi-socialist economy. I know the limitations of that system and the problems. I also grew up in a place which venerated community and closeness and all those things, which are wonderful, but I think also limit a human being in terms of his ability to move and thrive and prosper. Sometimes, you know, when I hear these great paeans to small-time village life, you know, being written, of course, by academics living in Manhattan and London and Paris, I want to reach for an oxygen mask, because I grew up in a country that had lots of those villages, and it can be nice and wonderful. It can also be incredibly confining and stultifying to human ambition. Urbanization is one of the great engines that have allowed individuals to find themselves, and cities are these amazing places where individuals are able to be individuals, not members of families, groups, ethnicities, classes, castes, and subclasses. So I think all of that plays some role, but probably more than anything else, you know, I had very good parents. I think that if you can manage it, choose good parents.
Okay, we've got the microphone here. Okay, this table, and then we'll go to Nelson just behind him.
I want to test your capacity for optimism by asking you to comment on whether you see any way out of, with sequester about to descend, out of the paralysis, or what seems to some of us the dysfunctionality of the American system, particularly because it does seem to an outside observer that it's very much a product both of the influence of money on the one hand, and a congressional system that distributes seats in a way that almost ensures ongoing division and hence gridlock. But given your optimism, I'm hoping you can provide a happy scenario that leads us out of the morass.
Look, I'm honestly very worried, and I think that this is the great problem with America. America has an incredibly dynamic economy. It has an incredibly dynamic society. It has a broken political system, and it's quite dysfunctional. And the problems are really dealing with the long-term challenges, particularly around healthcare costs, which are going to be monumental for the United States to deal with. That's where the real problem is. And that's going to be very, very tough to handle. That said, let's keep in mind that if we had agreement and comedy and great bargains and grand bargains, the kind that would have had lots of people cheering, over the last 3 years, we would have done the wrong thing. Which is to say, I think it is by now clear that premature austerity programs in situations of near zero interest rates and with a highly depressed economy are not a good idea. And you can look at Britain, you look at every European country if you want as an example. What we would have done had there been greater political agreement would have been more tax hikes, more spending cuts earlier on. So in a strange way, the gridlock and paralysis which forced the American system to do nothing hasn't worked out that badly in the short term, because it's pushed off any premature austerity programs until now. Now, even of this one, this is the least bad of the options we had, right? There was the fiscal cliff, which would have had a $3 trillion tax hike. There was the default on the debt, which was a total catastrophe because it would have said the United States is not willing to pay its bills. And then you have this one. So this one is a 0.6% hit to the GDP. That's the number in terms of the total spending cuts. It's not a good thing. It's stupid because it is particularly crude in the way it's done. It is tackling all the spending we shouldn't be cutting and leaving aside all the spending we should be cutting. That's sort of, I want to understand what it is the sequester is cutting. The sequester doesn't cut Social Security, Medicare, all the big entitlement programs. It cuts only such trivia as education, high-tech research, scientific research, investments in infrastructure. In other words, all growth-oriented investments get cut. All present-day consumption, often bloated, is exempt. So it's from that point of view, a total disaster. My own guess is it will happen, but for a few weeks, and they will come to some kind of compromise where some of these things will be delayed, and at that point, the effects will be lessened. If you were to ask yourself, what are the fundamental drivers of American growth going forward? I would say they are the fundamental vitality of the American economy and the dynamism of the tech sector, the transformation of energy taking place in the United States with natural gas, shale, tight oil, the extraordinary demographic realities in the United States where we are growing as a population, adding 3 million people every year to the population, which ensures that housing is going to be a vibrant sector eventually. And maybe not so far off, because you can't keep adding 3 million people to the population and not have vibrant. It's just at some point kids aren't going to want to live with their parents. And a bet on American housing is a bet on that proposition. All these things have been facilitated or not hampered by government policy, right? So when you think about it, what are the big two things I worry about? The big two things I worry about are healthcare costs in the long run and a deficit of investment in infrastructure more than anything else. And those have to be dealt with. And on the second one, I hope that there will be a public-private partnership that will find a way. The solution is so obvious and so elegant that it's bizarre that it's only the fact that the Republican Party has gone into a kind of Neanderthal phase that makes it impossible to get to, which is to have an infrastructure bank that leverages the public capital on a 10-to-1 basis, which gets you enormous bang for the buck, borrows money it's not near historic rates. Rates have never been this low, and they will never be this low. You're never going to have a situation when people are paying the U.S. government to keep their money. And for us not to build, for us to have the 10-year bond at 1.4 or 1.6%, and John F. Kennedy Airport look the way it does, is unconscionable, right?
Larry Summers had the same little anecdote in November about the airport.
It's entirely true. I mean, that's the extraordinary thing, which is that, I put it another way, it's all deferred maintenance, because it's going to have to be done, right? And the point at which, we all know this from maintenance on our houses. You cannot deal with it, but that's not fiscally prudent, because one day the whole thing blows up and then you have to fix it and it's more expensive, and that's what we are going to have to do. So that piece of it, I think is ultimately going to get fixed. Healthcare costs is the big. So that's my good news scenario too, is that the dysfunctions of the American government haven't actually screwed us up that badly until we get to healthcare in the out years.
Okay, I think we've got Nelson, who's just put your hand up, and you get the microphone. Thank you.
In my short lifespan, the population of the world has tripled from roughly 2.4 million to just over 7 billion, or 2.4 billion to just over 7 billion. So my grandson had a question at school. He said, what's the worst problem we have in this world? Is it drugs? Is it crime? Is it whatever? And when I look at the hockey stick growth, to me, the worst problem seems to be we don't have any water problems or pollution problems or garbage problems if we don't have people. But everything else escalates in that thing. So I'm trying to figure out, there's got to be an end to this somewhere. what is the, in your opinion, what is the world's worst problem today?
Bjorn's
Oh
gonna
gosh.
answer. While he thinks about that, I'm going to put a plug in for Bjorn Lomborg coming on June 3rd, whose entire book is on that exact same question. And Don picked Fareed, and Don's picked Bjorn. Pretty good speaker. I think you should come. Has that given you enough time to think of your answer yet?
Sure. Look, I think that the population problem it actually might turn out to be a short-term problem, by which I mean to say, in the long run, every rich society starts to face the opposite problem of the one you're worrying about, which is a population decline, right? Look at Japan, look at Germany, look at Italy. All these countries, basically what happens is after a while you grow rich enough, your women are educated, and you start having declining fertility rates. It's even happening in places that have gone through quick modernization, like South Korea, Singapore. South Korea and Singapore have the lowest fertility rates in the world right now. Poland has a dramatically declined fertility rate, among the lowest in Europe, despite being Catholic, despite being young, despite being, new to the development phase. So the problem is, how do you get through this hump? Look, I think at the end of the day, this gets back to the optimism-pessimism thing. I look back to the 18th century when this dour English cleric, Thomas Malthus, wrote this very famous essay on population, in which he argued with absolute analytic rigor that England was not going to be able to feed itself. That the problem was that population was growing geometrically, food production was growing arithmetically, the two lines could not meet, and as a result, there was going to be mass starvation in Britain. The problem was, what he didn't count on was the human response to that problem. And the human response to it was two things. One, mass immigration to the United States. But the second was the agricultural revolution, followed by the industrial revolution. Britain, far from not being able to feed its own people, became one of the breadbaskets for the world because of the agricultural revolution. And if you look at what we are able to do with agriculture today, it's extraordinary. In 1900, 70% of the American population was engaged in agriculture. Today, 2% of the American population is. We produce many, 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 many times more food than we did in 1900, with 2% of the population compared to 70%. So human ingenuity is extraordinary when pressed. So when I look at issues like water, I worry, but I have at the back of my mind this feeling that, human beings will find ways, whether it's desalination, whether it's more efficient use, whether it's other things. I think that the whole history of commodities has been the ability to find new ones, to substitute, to create compounds, to some way use, find what you need to use. The one place that I worry about, and I think that Bjorn Lomborg is in many ways very thoughtful about this subject, is what to do about broader systemic changes like climate change and the impact that climate change has on weather and on patterns. Again, I'm not somebody who believes the world is going to end, but I do think that they are having a major impact on life as we know it. And if that impact continues, we're going to have to get pretty darn good at adapting and pretty darn good at figuring out exactly what it is that we can adapt to and what it is that we need to mitigate against. So if I was to say, what is the biggest danger in the world, it's those kind of global level problems that you can't easily invent your way out of.
Okay, we have another question there.
Dr. Zakaria, I'm glad you picked a sunny day to visit Vancouver, and I hope that you will have a chance to linger and enjoy our beautiful city. I'll take some liberties with our moderator and ask you two questions. The first one is Canada going to get a break on the issue of the pipeline? In other words, do you think the arguments in favor of the pipeline, such as we're a friend of the United States, Alberta has done more than any of the States in the United States on carbon reduction. You reduce Middle Eastern imports, etc. Do you think these arguments will prevail against the environmentalists? And if you'll forgive me, the second unrelated question is to pick up on the gentleman earlier on the fiscal situation in the United States, where the problem as I see it, if I was Treasury Secretary in the United States, I would wake up one morning and say, the first mortgage in my house is held by China, and the second mortgage is held by Russia, and the value of my house is underwater. What do I do about that? Where do you think this is going to end? Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, well, let me take the second one first. So, who is more vulnerable in that relationship, China or the United States? Suppose you were China and you are producing several tens of billions of dollars of surplus capital every year, and you have to put it somewhere. What are you going to do? Okay? You could put it in the euro, but that ain't looking so good these days, right? If you're trying to make long-term investments that are stable and liquid, do you want to be in a currency that might not exist 10 years from now? You could put it in the yen, but I did mention the small problems the Chinese have with the Japanese, and anything that confers upon the yen anything like reserve currency status would not be something the Chinese central bank is likely to do. You could put it in pounds or Swiss francs, but there aren't so many of those. You need large, deep pools of liquid assets. You could buy copper mines in Brazil and China and in Uganda, but once you've bought 5 of those, you still have $75 billion left to do something with. You kind of are forced to buy US Treasuries, because that's the only large, safe, liquid pool of investment that you can find. So now let me ask you, if the US Treasury were to say to China, you know what, you're complaining about this all the time, from tomorrow you can't buy any more US Treasuries, who would suffer more, China or the United States? The US actually, by the way, most of the debt is bought now by Americans. It's not bought by the Chinese. The Chinese were the marginal buyers. They still buy a little bit more. But by and large, this myth that we are, that the Chinese own the United States, and certainly the Russians, is largely that. But more importantly, what would the Chinese do? First of all, they already have $2 trillion of the stuff. That would start dramatically losing value. Secondly, where are they going to put it? So I think you have to understand that the relationship, in an interdependent economy is more like mutually assured destruction. They can't afford to sell. We can't afford to have them not buy. I'm not sure who's more vulnerable. All I'd say is, at the end of the day, it's a situation in which both people have prospered by maintaining the relationship. Neither prospers by the relationship being broken. So why would it be broken? It's not clear to me that China has any power over the United States on this issue. It might actually be, as I say, that the United States has some limited power over China. On the Keystone issue, you're asking for a political judgment, not an economic one, because economically the answer is obvious. We should go ahead with the pipeline. And the simplest argument for it is none of the ones you mentioned, is that whatever effects it's going to have, the oil is going to be burned anyway. So when people say it would be bad for the environment, it has nothing to do with where the oil is burned is not going to make a difference. The oil is going to be burned. And so that's the only relevant criteria, it seems to me. And if that's the case, why shouldn't the United States take advantage of all the factors you were describing? My guess is that it'll go through because the Obama administration was not doing it to satisfy some very large and important constituencies before the election. Those conditions become less pressing when the president is not up for re-election.
We have so many questions here, but we're coming to the end of our formal program. So I will say, for all of the people who still haven't had their questions answered, Fareed is going to stay, and we do have champagne being served. And I know for sure that his answers are going to be even better with more champagne. So I encourage you to stay and ask some more. So I guess I'll end the formal part here just by going back to the issue that you were talking about, technological advances. You've also talked about the challenges that the world has with how quickly global politics is going to change, or that it's slower than the economic solutions we're coming up with. Do you think that the next generation's global mentality, because of their exposure to technology, will accelerate an improvement in global political sensibility?
Oh gosh, that's a big, interesting question as to, you know, what is the impact of technology on human beings and on human politics. I tend to think that technology is a wonderful thing, and the technology is having all kinds of incredible impacts. If you look at the way technology has played a role in the Arab Spring, you see it in one form. It's not just, by the way, Facebook or Twitter, as people talk about. If you had gone back to Egypt 10 years ago, you would have noticed that in Egypt, in your hotel room, you could only watch 1 or 2 channels. There were Egyptian state television, maybe 15 years back, if you go back 15 years. And those Egyptian state channels would really have been the kind of diary of the dictator, by which I mean to say all that you'd watch on prime time was, this is what Mr. Mubarak did this morning, this is what he did at lunch, this is what he went in the evening. And it
reality
was
TV.
It was a reality TV for one guy, right? And then comes the satellite revolution, which is the first great technological revolution. All of a sudden you can watch BBC and CNN and later Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya, and that opens up the eyes of the average Egyptian to the fact that there's all this other stuff going on in the world. And by the way, a little bit about what's going on in Egypt, but they don't cover Egypt that much, right? Then you get the internet revolution, and now you start getting dedicated websites that do start focusing in on Egypt and on Cairo and on specific issues. For example, who is being arrested and why are these people being arrested, and pointing out the kind of counter narrative to what the state is telling you. And that becomes a huge part of the Arab Spring. It was Egyptian websites telling people why Egyptians had been arrested and how they had been wrongfully charged. And then you get the mobile revolution, which basically dramatically lowers communication costs so that the cost of organizing and gathering is virtually zero. So that you can get in the green movement in Iran, people gathering in little parks in Tehran all over because they were using the Iranian equivalent of Twitter or even just text messaging. So all these things are happening, and they have this huge and powerful impact. And I want to believe that it's going to produce good things, and it's going to produce good outcomes. What it's clear it does is it produces change. And you can see that in the Arab Spring. But whether the Arab Spring is going to have a good outcome still depends on politics. It still depends on good politics, good leadership, wisdom, civic action, civic activism. You know, think back to an earlier period when you were looking around at the world and you were seeing incredibly exciting technological developments. The rise of radio, the rise of telephones, telecommunications, the early beginnings of what would become television, all this happening, the rise of technologies that would allow us to split the atom. And the leading country in the world by far, the most advanced country in the world, the country that had won more Nobel Prizes than Britain and the United States put together, was Germany in 1933. So you still need good politics. Good science isn't enough.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Fareed.